All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. And those of you who are return visitors, I appreciate you coming back. So before we turn this all over to Julie, give you a quick introduction. And again, this will be a repeat for quite a few of you, but about Cascadia Conservation District. So I'm Kirk Beckendorf, an environmental educator with Cascadia, and we are a non-regulatory organization agency, and with the goal of promoting wise stewardship and conservation of all the natural resources here in Chelan County. And our board and staff members, we work with local landowners and the communities, provide assistance for soil and water and forest, fish, and wildlife conservation efforts. And we serve all of Chelan County. Have a number of different projects that we sponsor and lead, and some of these are some of the examples. This particular education program is funded by Washington Department of Ecology, and they provide funding for a number of our programs. If you want to get in contact with us more, our email or our website down there on the bottom, and our phone number as well. And you all have my email address as well. So next 2 weeks, we have next 2 Mondays, still 2 more sessions for our Native Planting 101. Next week with Mel Asher, she's going to talk about native plant selection and maintenance. And on March 29th, we're going to have a native planting panel discussion with our speakers, although Mel's not going to be able to be there, but there are other 3 speakers will be attending. I'll be sending out an email form requesting questions, so we can kind of front load some of the questions, and we'll see how this panel discussion goes. Haven't done that before via the Zoom, so should be a fun evening. So keep it up, and I'll be sending out emails on those as well. So tonight we have Julie Sanderson. She's going to be talking about weed management for restoration. Julie's a botanist. She's the coordinator for Chelan County Noxious Weed Control Board. And before she got into the weeds, Julie worked for 8 years with the BLM on rare plant and restoration projects. She taught plant taxonomy and biology at Wenatchee Valley College. She's a member of the Wenatchee chapter of the Washington Native Plant Society and holds degrees in botany and plant pathology from University of Wisconsin. And she calls, for the last 28 years, calls Washington home. So Julie, I'll turn it over to you. So during our presentation, you can use the chat to ask questions, and we'll stop periodically and present those questions for Julie to answer. I believe she may have a couple of slides throughout where she'll specifically stop for those questions. And we'll have time for Q&A afterwards as well. So,
Julie, okay, well, thank you, Kirk, for the introduction. And I just want to add that when I originally started to do this class for the Conservation District, it was quite a while ago. And, you know, I called this talk Weed Management for Restoration, and I pictured big restoration projects like things I worked on for the BLM. And over the years, I realized that most of our audience, you know, are all kinds of people with big properties, small properties, with what they have in common is trying to get more native plants into their landscape. And so I've tried to tweak the talk a little bit to make it more, bring it home, to really make some content that'll help you look at your property, no matter how big or small it is, and find all of these little microsites that might need weed management, and to be able to have some tools to use to make decisions about weed managing in all different kinds of places and circumstances on your property, because there are all kinds of things that will really dictate how you do weed management. It's not always, you know, just one size fits all. So the first thing I want to talk about is just thinking about what a weed management plan is. you got some handouts, I believe, emailed to you. And one of them had an integrated weed management plan checklist. And that's kind of the core of this management planning, is to use that checklist. And then there are some other templates that came along with that. And so for each of those templates will make part of your checklist a little bit easier to do if you follow the templates. So throughout, we're going to be referring a little bit to those handouts that you have. And if you are doing a big scale restoration, or you're just putting in a little native plant bed on the south side of your house where it's dry, I just want to keep in mind that weed management always has to be part of your plan, whatever you do on your property. Even if you're just putting in a new driveway or building a shed, weeds will happen wherever you disturb the soil. So we're going to look at all different places and circumstances for weed control.
Julie, are you ready to share your screen?
Oh, am I talking without my screen
Yes.
shared? Well, gee, I feel like I'm standing out here in my pajamas. Just a second, let me do it.
Those handouts have not been emailed out, but I just posted a link to the weed management plan that is they can access right now. So if you go to the chat, there's a link there.
Okay, so you have a minute to do that before we actually get to the templates. So anyway, I was talking and talking, and now I seem to have lost my ability to use my arrows here. What happened? Okay. There we go. Screen is shared and slides are advancing. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Okay, so basically what we're going to talk about is what is integrated weed management planning for restoration, big or small. Okay, so this is one of the templates that is included in the packet of information that I sent. And if we look at this, we're going to be talking about sites on your property. And the template, this template A, I think helps you to think about what is a site? You know, what have I got to worry about on my property, and where is it? So if you were going to fill out this template for your particular property, and we get to this part about location, it says be specific for your sites, okay? Vegetable garden, driveway, ornamental shrub beds, planters, pots, anything can be considered a little microsite on your property. So you'd want to be thinking about your weed management in all of these different places. You could have lots of copies of template A, depending on how many sites you have on your property, how many things you identify as places that might need some different kind of weed management. And then you want to look at that particular site and say, well, what kind of species of weeds do I have here? And make a list of the ones that you have that are problematic and the ones that you want to control. You also want to think about the size of the area, because that makes a big difference when it comes down to, am I willing to hand pull these in a 3 square foot area? Am I willing to hand pull in a 100 by 100 foot area? So that size of a property and the size of the microsites that need management will make a big difference. And then you want to think about your management goals. A lot of people go through their life trying to avoid stating goals because it's a little problem we all have, I think. But when it comes to weed management, your goals can actually set you free. If you know what your goal is, and it may not involve having absolutely no weeds in this area, right? And so having a goal like that, maybe in this area, all I want to do is control the noxious weeds, or all I want to do is control the tall weeds. It can make a difference in what you're going to do. And if you have something like grass in your yard and you want to have a really nice turf, now that'll be a different kind of a goal, because there you probably are going to go for almost zero weeds, or maybe only weeds that blend in nicely with the grass, okay? So having those management goals for each site is important. And then I think a photo or a sketch of these areas is helpful, because sometimes we're really making progress and we don't recognize it because you're not looking at a before and after picture. It's one of the things that was really important when we did restoration back when I worked for the BLM is you want to see some progress. And the first year, the second year, it kind of doesn't look any different. And then by the third year, you're kind of used to the way it looks. But then if you look back at year 0, you can see, wow, you know, we really made some difference here. So I think those before and after, especially photos, are really helpful. And I think a lot of times on our own properties, we don't think about taking those kinds of photos, but they can be really useful. So the other thing that we have in that packet is our template B, and that is the summary of weed species data. So if you look back at your template A, we wanted a list of species, right? For this site, that site, whatever. You might have 3 different sites. For each site, you have different species. Well, then what you want to do with template B is make a list of all your weed species and their common name, and then give those a priority. Are these high, medium, or low priority weeds? And then list what you can find out about them. You're going to learn about their life cycle and when they're most vulnerable to control. And then also you want to start making a list of effective control methods. You know, so say, for example, you have something that's a rhizomatous weed and you're going to keep mowing it. Well, you'll find out that's not a very effective control method. So you might have to go back, reassess that particular plant and do some research, call me, come up with a better effective method, a more effective method for control. So thinking about the fact that there are different ways you can control weeds, but maybe one is the most effective, and start to compile information about all the weeds that you have that you're trying to control so that you can be getting the best bang for the buck. You don't want to, you know, do something over and over that's not working. Okay, so that's an important template too. And if obviously you can make this template as big as you need. If you are so unlucky to have 20 different weed species to control on your property, then you're going to have to make this list quite a bit longer. But you know, that this is just a template giving you some ideas of what to think about. And I just want to mention, you know, later I'm going to show you some resources that you can use, but the scientific name and the common name are really important. Both of them are important for 2 reasons. One is that the type of information you get on the internet, I think sometimes depends on whether you use the scientific name or the common name. I think if you use the scientific name, you tend to come up with maybe more reliable information and information from better sources. But if you use the common name, knowing the right common name to use is important. And when I say the right common name, there's not really an official common name, but there is an official list of common names that are used by chemical companies when they list on their labels, and the label is a legal document. And so there has been a consensus on what to call plants so that they can be, the names can be used on those labels, and they'll be the same throughout the industry, the herbicide industry. So knowing that sort of correct common name that is at the Weed Science Society of America website. And I'll show you a link later, I guess a link to that website. And they have a really nice weed gallery and a list of the accepted common names. So that is important too. Okay, so you'll have your summary of weed species data. So you're really gathering a lot of data at this point. And so one of the reasons you want to gather all this data is, we'll look at this bad boy, okay, kochia. One of the important things is knowing how to identify kochia, because obviously it looks just like a big green bushy thing, and a lot of plants look like that. But one of the particular characteristics of this weed is that it breaks off at the base at the end of the year, and it can tumble. So you can see here the path where a kochia plant tumbled and scattered all these seeds over this nicely prepared seed bed that was probably, you know, plowed and tilled over in the fall, got ready for the spring planting. And then this kochia rolled over there in the winter, dropped all those seeds. So knowing some of these characteristics about the plants that you have, is it a tumbling plant? Is it an annual or perennial? This happens to be an annual, and it comes up from seed every year. And so if you could get these plants when they're small and prevent it from doing this and going to seed, once it has all of these hundreds and hundreds of flowers, which you can barely see, they're very small, you can get this thing under control. So when we're looking at that template B, this is the kind of stuff you want to know. You know, what does this plant do? What are its characteristics? What are its strong points and its weak points? Unfortunately, for many of our weed species, they don't have a lot of weak points. So if there's even one, you have to exploit that. So it's good to know as much as you can about all of the species that you list on that template. So these are some of the things that I have listed here that you could be finding, looking on the internet, reading in books about weeds. All of these things might impact what you're going to do to control that plant. And I think for kochia, what I like to highlight as its weak point, I mean, you look at all these other things, it's annual. It can be up to 6 feet tall. So that means it's a fast grower. It has a long taproot, so that's going to be hard to pull. Tolerates dry and fertile soils, can grow just about anywhere. Prolific seed producer, 14,000 seeds per plant. That's kind of probably a low estimate. But then some of these things make it a little more vulnerable. The seed viability is quite high at 75%, but it only lives in the soil for 1 to 2 years. So if you could prevent seed production for more than 2 years, you could get rid of your kochia. So that's one weak link, and that's the kind of thing you want to know about each plant. What do I have to do to really get this thing? It only reproduces by seeds, so you're not dealing with a plant that can resprout from a root crown or from rhizomes. It does have another strong point. It germinates in the very early spring and pretty much all throughout the summer from 36 degrees to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Whatever, it'll germinate. So that one is one of the problems, because you might spray early and then more seedlings come up later. And then this dispersal of seeds by tumbling, this is a real problem. I mean, this time of year, March, we start getting our spring winds and the phone starts ringing here at the weed office because people hate tumbling plants. You know why? Because they come from their neighbor's house. And that's a very contentious issue in neighborhoods when you have weeds tumbling, because what they're doing while they're tumbling is they're spreading their seeds. So we don't want that to happen. So anyway, getting to really know these plants helps you come up with some strategies for controlling the plants. So for example, kill plants when they're young to prevent seed production. If the only way this plant can get around is by spreading seeds and getting big and rolling, then it would be very clever of us humans to kill these plants when they're young and prevent that. Mechanical control, tilling, pulling, repeated mowing definitely reduces the seed production, and if it's not a big plant, it really can't roll. So chop it up and keep it where it is. It'll prevent that rolling problem. There's no biological controls available for this one. Herbicide application is successful in the early spring before flowering on plants up to 1 foot tall, and you have to use surfactant because it's very hairy. In fact, some people say don't even try to spray it until it's over 6 inches tall, because as it grows, it tends to lose some of its hairs, but also the hairs spread out. As the leaves expand, the hair appears to be sparser because there's more leaf surface area. So then you can get your herbicide in. If you're going to spray, you might as well spray at the optimum time. And then also always replant with competitive plants, irrigate if you can, or use natives on drier sites. So that's fits right in with our goals for this native planting 101. So that brings, so those last 3 slides are just to show you, this is how much information you should be gathering about your weed species, okay? It may seem like a deep dive just in one plant, kochia, but there's a lot of information out there. And the more you know about the weeds you're trying to control, the easier it is in the long run to control them. So then that brings us to part C of your handouts, the integrated weed management plan. So once you've put all that effort into part A and part B, this is where you really kind of make your plan. Of course, every plan can be changed, but try to do this part C for each of the areas that you find need weed control, and also for each area. So your weed species for control. So after you did the first 2 templates, now you know which ones you want to control. But when you're really ready to start doing some control and you want to list the species you're really gonna focus on. And so you list those weeds and parts of their life cycle that are important for control, like whether it's an annual, perennial, you know, does it tumble, whatever. And then this is another important part now that we're really getting right down to it. If you're going to control these weeds, when are you going to do it? And so this is going to depend on some of the information you've learned about your weed, based on timing of germination, flowering, when does it set seeds? Do I have another week to mow, or do I have to do it now? So understanding those parts about your plant's life cycle will help you nail down the period of time when it's best to control each weed species. And then you want to actually decide, what am I going to do? Now, we'll talk a little bit more about each of these methods as we go along, but you have options when it comes to weed control. And we usually say the main ones are mechanical, cultural, chemical, biological, and I think there's one more, prevention. And so you want to really be specific about this as you're making your plan. No hand waving allowed. You have to know, am I going to actually pull these versus dig them or mow them or spray them? And if I am going to spray, what am I going to use? And is this the best thing to use in the area under the circumstances, you know, that I have? And then also, am I going to be able to follow up? Can I put in some compost or fertilizer if needed and reseed? Do I need irrigation to get things going in the area that I'm reseeding? And will this kind of treatment, like irrigating and seeding, be beneficial, or will I just be allowing these weeds to grow bigger and better? Have I really gotten rid of the weeds before I start, you know, amending the soil and doing something like irrigating and fertilizing, because those options will also benefit some of the weed species that you might be trying to get rid of. Then think a little bit about how you plan to monitor your weed species. Now, clearly, if you live on your property and you see things every day, you probably feel like, I don't need a monitoring plan. I mean, that's for like a big restoration. You can only get out there twice a year. You obviously have to make a plan about how you're going to monitor this. But actually, you know, think about, how will I know that this has been effective? You know, if I spray this and I go out and look next week, will I know it's effective? Well, maybe not. That's too soon. But then if I want to compare this site 6 months from now to what it looked like before I sprayed, you know, what's that going to tell me? And then the real tale will tell the following year when I look at the site again and take a moment to think, do I have fewer weeds than I did last year? Is this effective? And we really want to know that, because the last step of our management plan is to analyze, is my plan effective? Is it working? Because then you're going to have to think about, what do I do next? Do I do the same thing again? Do I have to switch up my method? Do I have to combine methods? So by looking and making a mental note to monitor and think for a minute about, has it been effective? That's when you'll be triggered to think about, well, maybe I should do something different this year, or maybe I have time to even do something different, you know, in the fall, as opposed to waiting till next year. So monitoring is important, and thinking about whether what you've done is effective or not is important too. So if you have gotten your handouts, you'll see that one of the handouts is a long, and I don't have a picture of that handout here, but it's a long checklist, and your integrated weed management plan checklist kind of fits in with those templates. It's just sort of a way to go through everything one by one and say, okay, did I do this? Yes. Did I do that? Yes. Okay. So we're going to go through this checklist just for one thing at a time here, and just kind of go over what each of the items on the checklist means. So defining your weed management goals that are compatible with restoration goals. Obviously, if you're going to put time and effort into establishing native plants, you really want to get rid of your weeds, hopefully before you get the plants in. But sometimes that's not possible. So you're going to be needing to manage weeds in amongst your new plants as well. And for these areas that you're trying to restore, it's good to have goals, but it's also good to break those goals into short-term and long-term goals, especially if you're doing a big planting. You know, what you want to see 3 years from now is probably very different from what you want to see 6 years from now. And so it's good to keep that in mind so that you don't lose heart, for one thing, because sometimes putting those little plants in, you have this big vision of how beautiful it's going to look, and they're little plants for 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe even 3 years before they really take off. So having an idea of what your goals are going to look like in the short term and then in the long term. And also, you know, if you have an area where you would like to do some restoration and planting, but you know you won't be able to get to it for maybe 5 or 6 years. You know, I'd love to restore the upper corner of my property, but I'm not going to even start till I retire. Does that mean I just can sit on my hands until then? No. If that's a long-term goal of mine, I should be doing some weed control right now. I might not be planting for 3 or 4 years, but there's no reason I can't get ahead on the weed control in an area that I have a long-term goal of restoring, or even making into a garden or something like that. So think about when you're actually going to be planting and doing your project, and then you can back up from there and get some things accomplished and meet some of your goals even in the short term. Okay, so the second thing on your checklist is describe the property to be managed. You all know your properties, but sometimes it really helps to sit down and draw a picture of it on paper, or pull your property off of a Google map. It's really interesting. I think I love to look at aerial views of property and around my neighborhood and my own property. And they change every couple years. They retake the pictures on Google Earth, and they can be really helpful to look at those pictures. And so if you think about the location of your property, the size of your whole property, plus the size of the area you're actually going to be managing in a different way because you're putting natives, that makes a difference too. Because, you know, if you have a small area that you're really going to be devoting a lot of time to because you're planting it to natives, are there other areas you're neglecting? So keep that in mind too. What is the size of your restoration area, but also what is the size of your whole property? Can you manage all this? Slope and aspect are super important. You know it's going to be a whole lot different if you live on a south-facing slope that's pretty steep than if you live on a north-facing slope, or in some place, probably not in this county, that's really flat, right? There's only a few acres in Chelan County that are really flat. And I wish I had a little more of them, but slope and aspect are also important. So get a good idea which parts of your property face which direction, and if you spill a bowl of peas, which way are they going to roll? Okay, so then once you kind of look at your site and you know what you're doing where, think about this kind of information. Do you know your soil type? Do you have irrigation? And if so, what kind of irrigation can you use? I mean, one big center pivot is going to make a difference on your property versus some irrigation drip tape or something like that. So what kind of irrigation you might be able to use, or the fact that maybe you have no irrigation, that's a real important one. Do you have ornamental plants already associated with weeds that you're going to have to be working around? You know, you might have some plants that you want to keep, but you want to kind of redo that area, put in some new things. What are you going to be working around, and how are you going to take those plants that you want to save, you know, and protect into account when you're working on weed control? Nothing like killing a desirable plant accidentally with herbicide. Ask me how I know. Native plants or animals associated with your land. You might live someplace where you have the privilege of seeing all kinds of native creatures that come walking through your property. And so obviously you want to take that into consideration when you're planning what you're going to do with your weeds. We'll talk a little bit more about some specific cases about animals and creatures on your property. And then really important is water systems. Do you have a creek or a little stream or something that runs through your property? Are you going to be working on land that's adjacent to water? Because there's all kinds of different restrictions and things to consider if you have water going through your property, and you definitely want to keep herbicides clear away from the water. There are actually herbicides that you can use near water, and that's a whole nother story, but That's a big consideration when you're thinking about your property and your restoration goals. Okay, weed identification, we all kind of went through this as one of the main focuses of the templates. And so as you're doing your template, you're obviously checking a few things off of this list. You're going to know all of your species, and you're going to know where you have infestations of which weeds. The method of weed introduction, this is an important one when we talk a little bit about prevention. Knowing where your weeds are coming from is important, and that's why so many people get cranky with their neighbors, because they're sure that all of their weeds are coming from their neighbor's house. And so that's a really important thing to know. Really, are they coming from your neighbor, or did you bring in a load of gravel that might be infested, or does your dog come home with burdocks all over him all the time? So there's a lot of ways that weeds can come into your property, and it's not always because your neighbor is throwing them over the fence or something. And then think about your risk ranking. How are you going to prioritize these weeds? Of course, I'm going to tell you that noxious weeds are all high priorities. But there are other things that are not on the noxious weed list, but they're just really invasive. And once they get into your property, it's very easy for them to spread. There are also plants that are allelopathic. You know, they produce their own kind of herbicides that prevent other plants from getting established. And so they might be a high priority for you to keep out of an area that you're trying to plant, even though for me, I could care less if you've got that plant. So I feel like noxious weeds are always a high priority, but there are a lot of different kinds of plants that you could rank highly when you're thinking about what you want to get rid of. You know, so let's use burdock again as an example. Burdock is not a noxious weed. It is an invasive plant, and it can be a real nuisance if you have pets and you also have burdock. That might be your #1 priority weed as far as you're concerned. And so getting to know those plants and which ones you really, really want to put some effort in to get rid of is part of this risk ranking idea. And then look at weeds in and around your restoration area, and look for areas of seed recruitment. Where do seeds really come from? Sometimes they're coming right from your own property in an area that you're not paying that much attention to, and it's just spreading around with the lawnmower or something like that. So within your own property, to look at those sources of weed spread. So then also when you're thinking about priorities, you want to prevent as much invasion as you can. And this would be also thinking about things that come into your property. Do you rent machinery? Do you have sand, gravel, bark mulch, compost, things like that, that you bring into your property? All of those could be a source of weed invasion. And then look at the intensity of your management. Are you going to be doing eradication? Like for the highest priority species, you might want to say, absolutely none, any place on the property, we're eradicating this weed. That's a big job, and if you commit to eradication on those high priority weeds, it's going to be maybe all hands on deck, maybe a little chemical, maybe a little pulling, maybe a little mowing, all of the things you can do to get rid of that weed. If you have big established stands of some kind of a weed that you just don't really have time for all this mulling right now, that might be a lower priority for you, but just be aware that if it is a low priority and you're not getting rid of it and it's continuing to go to seed, it may become a higher priority fast because of the invasiveness in other parts of your property. Okay, so that brings us to incorporating integrated pest management, or integrated weed management in this case, strategies, and looking at all of these and figuring out which ones are most compatible with your restoration plans. Where. So you might not use all of these in the same place. Sometimes you might. Sometimes there might be one that just works best for you kind of all over the place. So you want to look at all of these things. Prevention, like we just mentioned, where are the weeds coming from? Are there ways you can prevent them from coming in, or prevent new ones from coming in, because you've already got plenty to deal with? There's mechanical and physical, biological, chemical, cultural, and then of course revegetation, kind of as part of prevention. If you are successful at that, you can prevent plants from reinvading those areas. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of those in a few minutes here. And then the last part of your checklist again is that monitoring and evaluating. One good way of monitoring is just look at the population size. Is it actually getting smaller? Do you have fewer weeds than you did when you started? And think about, is your strategy working? And if not, what can I do to change it? Okay, it might be time to think about a different one of these parts of the IPM, or to use two of these in conjunction to improve the efficiency of your management plan. Okay, so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the management plan. Any questions so far do we have in the chat box?
None yet, but feel free
Okay.
to jump in, anybody, if you have any. We'll wait here a little bit and see if any pop in.
Okay.
So please provide best practice for controlling, eliminating Western salsify.
Oh, that one. Well, what you'll find out as we go through the rest of this is it's really hard to just say best practices, right? Because I don't know one thing about your property. And most of the time I tell people that weed control practices have to be tailored for your property. So now let's say you have Western salsify in a pasture and you have mixed grasses and legumes, and it's a huge pasture and you've got thousands of salsify plants. In a situation like that, you might want to actually spray that pasture. Your other options are hand pulling, mowing on a regular basis, but like dandelions, salsify will resprout and produce, unfortunately, more branches, and then consequently more flowers and more seeds. So mowing, unless you mow on a regular basis, kind of like at the rate you would mow a lawn, it's really pretty hard to control salsify by mowing. It's kind of it's a very flexible plant. It can act like an annual sometimes, or it can be a short to long-lived perennial, up to 10 years, the same plant. And so it's very flexible. It's very successful because of that flexibility in becoming kind of a perennial plant. And it seems that when you mow it, that encourages that more perennial nature, because it encourages more buds. And so the plant kind of develops a sprouting crown that can come back when you keep mowing it. So it depends. It depends. You can use a broadleaf herbicide on it effectively if it is a widespread problem in a large area that you don't want to hand pull. But basically, a lot of people have hand pulled and gotten rid of it. It's just a matter of how much work you want to put into it, and can you be persistent at the hand pulling. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that is a particularly tough one, and we get a lot of complaints about salsify. It's not on the noxious weed list, but it's one of those plants where you can really easily see the seeds actually spreading, because they're floating through the air. You can literally see those seeds coming from somewhere. And when they do start to go to seed, a lot of them are going to seed at once. And so you can get a little breeze that blows those seeds around, and you can see them landing. I mean, I have actually taken some photos of those seeds covering a lawn, which was a nicely maintained lawn. And then these seeds were coming from somewhere else and kind of carpeting the lawn. So it's very discouraging, because it's one that you really can't keep from invading into your property, because the seeds fly so far and eventually they do land somewhere. So
Right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a bunch. So what's an example of a cultural?
Well, you know what? Can I just hold on that one? Because
Yep.
after the questions, we're going to go through each of those methods
Okay.
one by one and explain what biological versus cultural and all that is.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. How about some specific recommendations for surfactants?
Surfactants. Okay. Some people just use detergent and that will work. There are several methylated seed oils which work very well. Some herbicides will recommend on the label that you use, say, an oil versus a sort of a synthetic ionic surfactant. it depends on the herbicide you're using. Some have specific recommendations for the surfactant that you need to use, and some don't. Some herbicides you'll buy, especially those that are the ready to mix formats, they have surfactant already in them. So you really need to look at your label and know if you're using a ready to use product or a concentrate. Usually if you're using a concentrate, you do have to add your own surfactant. And so I hear a lot of sort of homemade things. Well, I just put vegetable oil in. Oh, I just do this, I just do that. But I think if you're going to use herbicide and you're going to go to the trouble and the expense of buying herbicide, you should probably buy an appropriate surfactant. And you know, the best place to get a recommendation for the herbicide you're specifically using is at the place that you're buying the herbicide. If you're going to go someplace like Wilbur Ellis or Chamberlain and get something in a concentrated format that you can actually buy with or without a license, you want to get the right recommendation. And again, the label will sometimes specify, if it's important, which one you use. It'll tell you which one to use. And whichever one you use, you always should do a shake test where you put some of the herbicide and some of the surfactant in a bottle and shake it up and mix it to make sure they're compatible. And, you know, because sometimes you'll end up with some goopy glop that isn't going to go through your sprayer. I have seen that personally happening. And then you got a mess, because if you haven't done the shake test and you've gone ahead and mixed a tank full of this stuff, now you have a goopy gloppy mess that won't come out of the sprayer. You have to dispose of it some other way, or you have to, you know, really work at it and get it in suspension. So you should always do a shake test. And like I said, if you're going to buy a concentrate, read the label first, find out what kind of surfactant is needed, or if a surfactant is needed at all. And then get one that's appropriate, either a methylated seed oil or non-ionic surfactant, which is usually kind of a synthetic stuff. So any other questions?
Yeah, we have quite a few. So there's a number about different types of weeds. Are you going to be addressing specific weeds here in a bit?
Not a lot of specific weeds.
Okay.
And until the end, I was kind of going to go over more about different sites and ways of integrating those different methods.
Okay.
So.
So we also, it's also 7:45 at this point.
Oh, okay. Well.
So how about we
can we save some of those, like maybe for the panel discussion, or
we'll save the chat too, and then we can come back. And if we
have
time
and you know, I
at the end,
think if people have really specific questions about their property or a specific weed, I would be totally happy to answer some of those questions by email too, or a phone call or something. So I'm going to have a contact information slide at the end, because it really does depend on, you know, the situation of your property and what you're specifically trying to do. So maybe some of those could be better answered, you know, either at the panel discussion or specifically by email.
Do you have one general question? So what about attractive weeds that are beneficial to local birds or wildlife? Weeds that we like. How do you promote some and not others?
Yeah, you know, I must admit, I really like all plants, and some of the weeds are admirable because they have the most amazing characteristics. You know, if you fiddle and futz and try to make a tomato grow, and then you look over there and you see Russian knapweed just happy as can be on the hillside with no attention whatsoever, it kind of, you know, you have a little respect for that plant. But I would say that, you know, noxious weeds are always a priority to get rid of. Other things, if you like them and they aren't interfering with your particular goals, there's no really reason that you have to control them. So I would be considerate of the neighbors who may not like those plants as much as you do. And if you look at the characteristics of that plant and kind of figure out how easily does it get around, like salsify, you know, even if you like it and you think it's pretty, I don't think your neighbors are going to be happy if you let it grow, you know, uncontrolled. So I would think about that. Think about your own goals. If this isn't a noxious weed or one that you really need to control, you know, legally, think about your goal. Is it interfering with something, or can you let it grow there? You know, I think that's really up to you what your goals are. Okay.
Yeah. So,
All right. Well, let's try to get through some of the rest of this. The janitor is here vacuuming. I hope that isn't interfering with is that a big background noise? Is that okay? All right. Okay, so now we're going to look at more specifically what those different parts of integrated weed management are. So prevention, we pretty much talked about that. We'll go through each of these one by one. I like to say you've got your troubles, I've got mine, because of course noxious weeds are a whole different story. Weeds that are on the noxious weed list are those that really by law you're supposed to be controlling, and those are the ones that I focus on all the time. But there are a lot of nuisance weeds that cause a lot of trouble and a lot of intense effort to control them. So we have things like tumble mustard, prickly lettuce, horseweed, salsify, mallow, or buttonweed, depending on where you're coming from. I think you would call it a different thing. So any of those weeds, again, if they're interfering with your goals, you'd want to control them. But I'm not going to come around and make you control these. So again, when you figure out what weeds you've got, you're going to know which ones are going to be a higher priority for you to control. So we'll go through each of these integrated weed management kind of, I don't know, strategies. And one thing I wanted to remind people of is when we're talking about control in kind of the legal sense for noxious weeds, control means to prevent all seed production and also reproduction by vegetative means from or within your property. So when we're talking about control, that's different than eradication. So you can control weeds lots of different ways. Eradicating weeds means you actually completely remove them from your property. Okay, so the first one we'll look at here is chemical control. Like we talked about surfactants, reading the label is really important. It tells you how to use it appropriately so you don't use too much or you don't use too little. Some of the herbicides you just won't be able to buy unless you're a state licensed applicator. So you can go into Wilbur Ellis and say, you know, I want 3 jugs of Tordon, but if you don't have a license, you're not gonna be able to buy it. So depending on what you're trying to do and how big your project is, you might want to get somebody, a contractor who can do something for you that might require chemicals that you personally can't obtain. When you're using chemical control, you have 2 choices. We have selective herbicides, which kill a whole variety of different things, but they don't kill grass. And then you have non-selective herbicides, which kill everything. So for example, something like glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, kills grass, kills broadleaves, you know, kills a lot of things. With chemical control, you have the greatest liability in kind of accidentally killing things you don't want to kill, or maybe causing drift on your neighbor's property. So it is a method that you will undertake with a lot of care. And again, the label is actually a legal document, and you are obligated, if you're using herbicides, to read the label, understand what you're doing, and know that you're doing it correctly. So this type of control is never undertaken lightly. There are a lot of things to consider when you use chemical control. Biological control is really great, but the only problem with it is it's only effective on a few different plants in our area. It takes a long time to get a biocontrol to the point where it can be distributed in the US. It can take 10 to 15 years to develop a releasable biocontrol insect. The insects can be difficult to find. We're lucky in our area that we have.
Real quick. Karen will be here with an ozone machine, and you can't be here at about 8 o'clock.
Okay, I'll be out of here.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Sorry for the interruption. My office is being ozoned for COVID tonight, so I gotta be out of here before 8:15. I just found out. So insects can be difficult to find. Not that you're going to go out and look for them yourself, but some people try to order them on the internet. They can be expensive, but our local extension office, Dale Whaley, has an insect program. So on the plants that it's applicable for, he does collect and distribute biocontrol insects. It can require several years for you to see that something's happening. It's not a quick method, but it's very, very safe, and it's, you know, it's safe for the environment. And it's kind of an ecologically balanced way. It's not going to eradicate the weeds, but it's going to bring them into kind of a balance with the biological agents. And if you can tolerate a little bit of the weeds on the property to support the insects for the long run, then you know, maybe this is something that would work. Well, we don't have a lot of plants that we have biocontrols available for. Diffuse snapweed, Dalmatian toadflax, purple loosestrife, those are some of the easy ones that we can get bugs for. There's a couple others that usually are not. It depends on the year if we can get bugs or not. So it's not a real, it's probably not going to be your first option for control. But when it does work, it works great. Here's an example of Dalmatian toadflax that was controlled. This whole yellowish green area is toadflax in 2012. Here's the same area, yeah, just almost about the same time of year in 2016, and the toadflax is really, really, really gone. I mean, you hear the phrase, "my jaw dropped." When Dale showed me this pictures, really, literally, my jaw dropped. I just couldn't believe how effective it had been here. Really good example of it working. Here's another example that I also got from Dale Whaley. Here's a picture, I think along 97A, and most of what you see here is diffuse snapweed. Here's a stake in the ground, and that shows where the bugs were released. And if we look at that same picture, also notice the yarrow and not much else as far as native plants that we can see here. But then here it is 4 years later. The lupins have rebounded. The yarrow is still there, but this picture was taken, I think, a little bit later, so it's kind of not in full bloom right now, but there's still a lot of yarrow in there. The knapweed is gone. Some of the grasses, the blue bunch wheatgrass, is really increasing in the site. So this is a really good example too. But again, it took 4 years to get here. So if you've got time to wait and the right kind of weeds, you could use biocontrol. Mechanical is anything that you do to weeds to physically remove them, cut them, till them, hand pull them, dig them. It's often an incomplete method if you can't get to every single weed by hand pulling, or if you mow and then, you know, the plants just come back again if they're rhizomatous. So you have to understand the plant and use something like mowing or tilling appropriately for the species you're trying to control. So for example, Russian knapweed or white top, those are rhizomatous weeds. If you're just going to till, you might chop up the rhizomes, but they'll be back. And again, mowing really has very little effect on rhizomatous plants. So cultural control. So what cultural control is actually, it's whatever you can do to improve the competitiveness or the vigor of the crop or the plants that you are trying to grow, that they're your goal, your target, and helping them to compete against the weeds. So this could be the timing of irrigation, applications of fertilizer. If you're working on a large scale, like farming, rotating crops is considered cultural control, because when you do plant a different crop, maybe the timing of the mowing of that crop or the harvesting of that crop coincides with pre-seeding of the weed species, and then your crop is out of the way and you go in and spray the weeds or something. But cultural control is focused on the plants you want instead of the plants you don't want. And the idea is to make them stronger and more competitive to control the weeds that way. And then prevention, we already talked quite a bit about that. That's just anything you can do to, you know, prevent weeds from coming in, or even, you know, if you find the very first little patch of weeds, getting on it really quickly and preventing it from spreading further around your property. So anything you can do here, especially learning to identify plants at the early stage, or identifying, you know, the seeds and things that you might be picking off your dog. If this is something really, you know, invasive, you don't want to just pick them off and throw them on the grass, right? You want to get rid of them altogether. So that it's helpful to identify things when they're small, and also when before the seeds actually get established. So always with weed control, you're trying to prevent bigger problems, right? You have big enough problems as it is, and keep that in mind that you're going to try to control plants when they're small. You're going to try to prevent plants from coming in the first place. And I just want to go through a quick overview of a property here. This happens to be my property. I used to pretend it was somebody else's property because I didn't want you to know how many weeds I had, but this is actually my property. So up here in this corner, like from here, you can barely see the fence line here. And here, this is my future restoration project. It already has a lot of native plants up there, but it's full of cereal rye is the main grass. And so that's got to go. But we're going to zoom in at this property a little bit. And we're going to kind of lose the restoration corner as we zoom in. But we're going to look at what's here. We've got, you know, a house, a shop, some driveway, which is covered with gravel, some garden space. Up here's a little orchard. Here's a very steep hill. Remember, we talked about aspect and slope. This is very steep. All the peas your spill would run down this way. This is a fairly steep slope as well. So do we have any weed problems here? Let's take a look. Oh, yes. Red flags all over the place. This is what I mean by sites. So all of these red flags represent a different site. This is only 2.5 acres, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, at least 9 potential sites that have their own problems and their own solutions. And so when we think about planning, we have to look at all of these little microsites and think about, what could I do here? What could I do there? What kind of weeds do I have? So you're going to see why those templates come in handy, because there could be a lot of problems. So like up in this restoration corner, this is where my long-term goals are going to come into effect. I want to start restoring this corner in about 4 years. What can I do now? I'm trying to get rid of the cereal rye. One of the things that's kind of nice about cereal rye, it's one of those that doesn't have a long seed bank. So I'm trying to mow with a weed whacker up here every year to reduce the seed bank, so that by the time I am ready to do some restoration, I have that cereal rye kind of under control. And in the last 3 years, I can see a difference in the density of the cereal rye. It still comes up, but it's not as bad as it used to be. Steep mowed slopes and junk piles. These are microsites, right? A steep slope that gets continuously mowed, what's going to happen? You might end up with erosion. You might end up with bare patches, ruts, where you have disturbed sites where you can get weeds easily invading. And what about junk piles? I mean, there's going to be a lot of things you'll see as we go through here. Stone and gravel piles, okay? What do these piles have to do with your weed management planning? Well, where do the weeds grow? Around the piles. If you've ever had a pile that sits for even a month or 2, what happens to it is it gets full of weeds. Where do they come from? I don't know. But weeds grow around piles. And when we talked about animals in your property, when you're making your checklist, one of the animals to consider is rattlesnakes around here. So a pile of anything becomes a haven for snakes, and also the rodents that the snakes feed on. So you want to take into consideration the health of the snakes and the rodents, of course, but also the fact that you're less likely to go in there and hand pull weeds if you know there could be snakes in that pile. At least I should say for myself, I'm less likely to hand pull weeds. So I don't use herbicides in a lot of places, but around those piles I do, and I do it early before the plants get big, because I don't want to go hand pulling around piles, okay? We should probably just get rid of the piles of junk and stuff, and then we wouldn't have this problem. But if you do have piles and you have some long-term goals and you're keeping some rock or something like that for later, that would be a good spot for herbicide, especially if they're annual weeds. They come up and they're small at first, you can easily get rid of them. The orchard, we're just not even going to talk about. This is a world of problems. But when you do have something like that, an orchard or a bit on your property, pretty much it's gonna need some serious weed control. And this is where you want to have some professional help because you know, you have 2 different, an orchard itself is not just one microsite, it's actually 2 microsites. You want a pathway that you can maintain some good turf just to cover the soil. I don't really care much what's in there, and it gets mowed. Continuous mowing tends to breed certain kinds of problems in itself, But then your second microsite is you want some bare ground around the trees and around the sprinklers so that the sprinklers can function properly. And so bare ground is a whole nother ball game, and it's usually ends up being herbicide, or in organic orchards, they may till very shallowly under the trees to maintain some bare ground to keep the sprinklers working properly. You can't have bindweed growing up around your sprinkler heads or they stop working really quickly. So another microsite. So we got this, we got this, we got this. We have microsites all over the place. Wood piles and equipment parking are very similar to junk piles and rock piles. Places where things sit and tend not to get used all the time, you get weeds growing around them. And unless you do something really preventive, like say, you know, putting down a concrete slab or a thick gravel pad for parking areas, those are good preventive measurements. So you don't have to keep spraying around your equipment parking and things like that. So when you're thinking about prevention in a site, you know, weeds are going to happen here, it might be worth it in the long run to put in something like a permanent solution, like mulching, landscape fabric, or even a concrete slab. You know, if you know you have a place where you need to store an RV or something like that, instead of having weeds growing up through the tires, you might want to do something more permanent to prevent that problem in the first place. Driveway, lots of gravel. People have really mixed feelings about weeds in their driveway. In some cases, some weeds are nice for dust control. In other cases, weeds are a problem in gravel because they do kind of undermine your road bed. If you have weeds that get big tap roots, they can cause the beginnings of potholes. And the other thing is, gravel in the summer becomes gravel covered with snow in the winter. And if you use either a scraping type of snow removal or snow blower type of snow removal, pulling up old dead weeds that have frozen into those implements can cause problems, clogging, and so sometimes it's nice, even if you don't care about the weeds that much, to control them so that you don't have trouble in the winter when you're trying to get those surfaces clean, and the weeds can really inhibit the equipment from working properly. On a driveway, you could hand pull, you could use a hoe and just shallowly scrape the weeds if it's something with not a really burly taproot. If you are going to use chemicals on a driveway, there's an extra problem you have to think of, and that is the movement of dust. Some chemicals that cling to the soil, like dicamba and some of your pre-emergents, the idea is they're in that soil. And so if the soil moves, the herbicide moves. So driveways have their own special problems with chemicals, and the fact that water moves down driveways. It doesn't necessarily always percolate. And so you might be moving chemical down and off the driveway into a place that you weren't planning to put herbicides. So while herbicide is a good option, especially used early in the year, you have to use it with caution on driveways especially. Grass and clover planting with uneven watering. This is one thing I love about Google, is you can get this bird's eye view of your property and you can see where your sprinklers aren't working. Sometimes, for some reason, when you're on the ground, it doesn't seem as obvious that you have some problems, but you can clearly see from space these areas where the irrigation is not working. And what happens in these areas is you get more weeds. So you might be doing really well right here, and say you're going to put your native planting down here, and you can use a little irrigation for the first couple of years to get things started. But if you've got an area like this that's full of weeds that's continually seeding into your good area, that could be a problem. And so having a good idea, if you are going to use irrigation, of where your irrigation is missing is important in a preventive aspect of control, because you don't want to get these little colonies of weeds interspersed in these edge areas where your control might be a little lax, because it's maybe along the fence line and you don't pay attention to it there. So getting an understanding of where your irrigation is not working is always important, because these areas, I know, like especially in a lawn, you're trying to maintain turf, where you get the weed problems, take a close look, because often where the weeds show up first is where your irrigation isn't working well enough for the grass to be strong and competitive, because grass itself, in a way, maintaining a lawn is a cultural control method, because if you maintain a good lawn, you're not going to have weeds in that lawn. So that's a cultural control method that you probably don't even realize you're using cultural control when you establish a lawn, but it is a good option for weed control in some areas. Just put grass in it and mow it. Here is a vegetable garden and also an arborvitae fence. So one thing to keep in mind when you are doing weed control is, you know, an area like a garden is going to be a really high priority for you to maintain, and probably maintain by hand pulling or hoeing or some shallow cultivation, because you don't want to put herbicides clearly in a vegetable garden, right? You don't want to kill your vegetables. But also, if you have things like this, these aren't my trees, they're my neighbor's trees, and I really, really don't want to damage those trees. So any weeds on my side of this fence, I'm going to be really careful and probably end up choosing to do mechanical control rather than chemical control. And with the idea of preventing as much weed infestation as I can, getting in there, getting the plants early before they go to seed, so that I don't have to worry about weeds on my side of the fence or accidentally killing my neighbor's arborvitaes. You know, they're expensive trees and they contribute a lot to the fence line and the property. So we don't want to be accidentally killing anything with herbicides. Then we also have this problem down here. We have some beehives. And here's another one of those places where the animals and the insects intersect with your weed management plans. What we like to do with our beehives is to put down landscape fabric and mulch very heavily around the hives with some bark mulch. And for two reasons. Well, it works well for controlling weeds. And you might think, well, yeah, you don't want to get near those bees with herbicide, but really, I just don't want to get near the weeds. I don't want to hand pull. I don't want to be near those hives, especially in the front of the hives, because the bees see that as a threat. So I don't want to have to hand pull weeds around the beehives, and I don't really want to spray near the beehives. And so what we choose to do there is considered a kind of mechanical control, because you're suppressing the plants by physically covering them up. So using mulch or landscape fabric and a heavy mulch really helps to suppress it, at least in a wide enough area around those hives that we don't have to bother the bees with weed control. Okay, more questions. I have a couple slides. The only thing I have left is some resource slides that I'd like to show you. And I think because of the timing, we are at 7 minutes after 8, and I think they're going to be coming in with the ozone machine in a few minutes. So if we have some quick questions we could answer, or maybe defer some to the panel later. I don't know, how do you want to handle that?
Sure. What about burning weeds?
Burning has its place. Just this week, talked to somebody about burning. So for example, you've got something, a thick thatch of knapweed, reed canary grass, something like that. Sometimes burning works well in conjunction with other methods. So if you want to burn a bunch of dead weeds with an actual like controlled burn, it can open up the area to make it easier for hand pulling, digging, or herbicide if you need to use that. So just burning to kind of clear the slate can be helpful. A lot of plant or weeds, burning doesn't necessarily kill the seeds. It doesn't mean you're going to burn and then get rid of the weeds. The other kind of burning is the little propane torch thing, the flamer, the weed flamer. That can be very effective on annual weeds when they're very small. You know, the flaming is not to go after like a 5-foot tall kochia. You want to go after weeds that are very small, little seedlings, because what you're doing when you're using a weed burner is you're wilting the plant beyond repair. Okay, so we don't want to see any flames. We don't want to see anything catching fire. If you've got some railroad ties that are forming a retaining wall next to your shop and there's weeds in front of them, you don't want to start the railroad ties on fire. I have experienced that. It is very scary. So use those burners with care. You know how our habitat is here. Everything's flammable, but they can be real effective. So like in the driveway example, burning those weeds early in the year in a driveway, that's a really good use for those propane burners because you're in the gravel, you're not going to catch anything on fire. And it does effectively kill annual weeds. But then like wholesale burning, like a controlled burn, not going to be real effective in controlling weeds, but it by itself, but it can help you kind of clear things up to get other methods in there.
So we have a few more questions, but considering you have a few more slides and you need to get out of your office, maybe we.
Yeah, I didn't know that was
Yeah.
going to happen tonight. So,
Right.
yeah. Okay, I just want to show you a couple resources that I think are useful. So if any of you are involved in Master Gardeners, you probably know about HortSense. It's a Washington State University Extension program, and this is their website. I'm going to give Kirk a PDF also of my slides. And so if you don't necessarily have to frantically write these things down right now, but just so that you know. And the other thing is, Google, you just say HortSense and you'll find it. Okay, so if you don't want to really write down that actual address, you can just type in HortSense. It's got a bunch of fact sheets for managing all kinds of weeds and garden plant problems. Not just weeds, but also they have things about insects and diseases and things like that. So this is a really good resource. University of California IPM webpage is really excellent. They've got this great weed gallery, and weeds are pretty much cosmopolitan. The weeds in California are very similar to the weeds here. So this is their School of Agriculture IPM website. The weed gallery especially is really nice. This is just an example of part of it. It has good pictures of the plants at all stages, seedlings, the seeds, the flowering plant, and it gives also some control recommendations. So I really highly recommend this. Is a great website. Another one is the Weed Science Society of America. So this one is also, it has a weed gallery, but this is the one where when you get into this weed tab, they have a list of the accepted common names. So if you're using an herbicide, usually on the label, there's a list of plants that it's known to control. So this means that the herbicide has actually been tested on these plants and found to be effective. And so knowing which common name, are they going to call it buttonweed or are they going to call it mallow? That's what you can find here. If you know the scientific name, you can look it up in that common name list and you'll see which name you're going to find on the herbicide labels. So they have a good weed gallery and other information about weeds, but they are also kind of the repository of that common name list. And then there's the Washington State Noxious Weed website. And on this website, they also have a weed gallery. So under the weed list tab, you can look at Class A weeds, Class B, and Class C. And there are pictures of all of the weeds. And when you click on one of the pictures, a fact sheet comes up. And at the bottom of the fact sheet, there's also a place that says something like read more about it in the written findings. And so the written findings goes into a lot more detail about each of the weeds. So that's also a great resource. Then there's also books. You can look up all kinds of information about weeds if you can find the books. The Weeds of the West is kind of the classic weed manual for this area. And then there's our little Noxious Weed handbook that you can put in your pocket. These are available. Usually we put them out at hardware stores and the chemical companies and all kinds of places. Usually the Master Gardeners have a stack of them to give away too. So that's kind of useful. And then here's my contact information. Oops, this is the wrong slide. This information is wrong. But if you call this number 667-6669, that was my old number, but it'll get you to the front desk anyway. We're located at 412 Washington Street, right across the street from where the Master Gardeners are, and the Commissioner's building is our office. And like I said before, if you have some weed specimens, you don't know what they are, you can drop them off and we can identify those for you. Okay, let's see. That email address is correct for me also. So like I said, we'll have a PDF of this and I'll I'll put the correct information in there before I give it to Kirk. So that's it for weed management planning. Gather information, make a plan, execute your plan, follow up with monitoring, and repeat the previous steps as often as necessary. And when you're doing your planting, find local inspiration. There's plenty of beautiful places out there that you can try to visit and get some inspiration for your planting with natives. And I think we have no time for more questions because it's 8:15 and I think they're going to turn on the ozone machine.
You don't want to be breathing straight ozone. That
No,
wouldn't be good.
no, I don't. So anyway, so I will be at the panel discussion Monday after next. So save your questions. I hope I answered some of them already, but write them down.
All right.
We'll try to address them later.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Julie, and thank
You're
you
welcome.
everybody for joining us, and hope you were able to get a lot of good information there. Again, remember next Monday and then the following Monday for the panel discussion. So everybody have a good evening, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you.